Hello guys, it's Steven with Team Covenant, and I am here with one of our favorite people, Lukas Litzsinger, a game designer for Fantasy Flight. He's lead design, as you probably know if you're watching this, on Netrunner, the living card game. So Lukas, hello, it's good for you to be with us. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, thank you for having me, it's awesome.
And let's start out with the most basic question, which is, tell us about the state of the game right now. How are you feeling about the state of Netrunner? Having watched the tournament yesterday, kind of seeing regionals run through, seeing regional reports, where is Netrunner for you, and how are you feeling about it?
I feel really good. I mean, we just had a 128-man tournament. We're going to try to hold another 128-man tournament today, which will feed into the finals on Saturday. The game is as popular as ever. Deck diversity is actually pretty good if you look at it in the last year. We definitely have some new hotness kind of showing up here at the tournament with Near Earth Hub, which has just released. That seems to be a very popular choice, but overall I think the game is in a pretty good state, and people are still having fun playing it and having fun exploring different things, and it remains to be a game where skill is going to play a big role in who makes it to the top of the tournament and who doesn't. And whenever you play a lot of games over a period of time, stamina will also play into that a little bit, but you'll see the best players kind of rise to the top, I think, over this tournament that we have, and it's been pretty awesome to see the level of competition that has shown up here.
Is there anything that you've seen as of yesterday that is surprising in any way, that either it's doing well or that it's not doing as well as you thought it might do competitively?
I was excited to see some noise getting up toward the top of the tables. A lot of people kind of think that noise isn't a very competitive choice right now, but I think that might not actually be the case, and you can take people by surprise with him, and he's only going to get better with Cash, which is a virus that's coming out pretty soon here. And so I think you'll see a little bit of a resurgence for noise, and I didn't really expect to see that yet, and so that was pretty exciting. On the Corp side, you're not seeing much Wayland, haven't seen much Wayland through regional season. I think the meta might be ripe for some Scorch Tag and Bag to come back. A lot of people aren't really running their fast greets anymore, but Inbi and Engine Techie seem to be the most popular choices. Hospiroid's pretty close behind too.
Yeah. Well, so we talked about kind of, you said exploring kind of some new things as the game progresses, and one of those things is currents, right? So we've seen this new thing that is known as a current that stays in play indefinitely until a new current is played or it's otherwise dealt with. Tell us a little bit about currents and kind of where that idea came from and what the flavor of the current is supposed to represent and how you're going to implement it in Netrunner.
Right. So the way a current works is there are current events and current operations. Corp and Runner both have them. And you play it on the table, and it stays on the table until another current is played. And if that was just the mechanic right there, it would be a pretty terrible mechanic, I'm not going to lie. It'd be like, oh, I play my current, and if you don't counter it, and I get it for the rest of the game, not terribly balanced. It's going to force people to put them in their decks, not what I'm interested in. So there's another really important part of a current, and that's if your opponent basically scores or steals an agenda, then it also goes away. Nice. So you're trying to find the window where you think you can get the most value out of it, and your opponent can always counter it early by playing their own, but your opponent isn't forced to deal with it because there's already a mechanism built into the game that can deal with a current. But the idea behind currents was really to give originally like the Corp a little bit more control. Like, it can be hard for the Corp to be a control sort of build, have control builds, because all of their stuff is pretty trashable other than ice. And so this gives them some temporary effects that can be very powerful that, the runner can't just run and trash when they have an economic advantage. And so obviously the Corps are going to get more currents now, but as time goes on, we'll mess around and play with it a little bit more, and I'm sure the runners will eventually catch up. But it was originally intended as an idea to give the Corps an extra choice in deck building, because the runners have a lot of choices with kind of what they want to try to counter, and the Corps don't have quite as many because you have agendas taking up deck spaces, and you have ice taking up deck spaces, and so it's like, here's something else that could be really, really useful, but you have to fit it in. And so I'll be interested to see if Corp players can actually fit some currents in and use them to their advantage.
So during the design process for the currents, what's it like trying to design a card that is useful but knowing that there's a few very easy kind of framework ways to get rid of it, right? So the runner can always just play a current, or potentially play a card that just discards a current if there's a card printed like that, like an event or something, discard a current. And then just stealing an agenda, it's like, well, I could have this current, I could pay 5 for a current, it lasts for a turn, and then it just goes away. So how do you try to balance that, you know, the strength of a current that could just be dominating if it's too good, but if it's not good enough, then it's like, well, it's just too flimsy, it's too weak.
I mean, one thing is cost. Like, you want to start currents cheap because they are temporary and they're an investment that's probably not going to stick around for an incredibly long period of time. So most current starts out pretty cheap. As their power level is kind of revealed, will bump their cost. So like you'll see a 3-cost current, you'll also see a 0-cost current, and that's kind of like the scale that we have for those cards right now. And a 3-cost will be pretty powerful and really affect the game while it's out, while a 0-cost is more about, it's doing something, but it's almost more of a counter to your opponent's currents. Like, you're not going to build your strategy around a 0-cost current, but a 2 or a 3-cost current, like, that could actually really affect the game while it's in play. And so you have to pay attention to those.
Nice. So as far as the design, we talked a little about the future design, which is currents, and I'm sure many more things down the road. But let's talk about the design of kind of the current things that we're seeing right now, and maybe some of the challenges there. I'm particularly curious about the Psy game. Right, so this is kind of a new mechanic that came in and was received both good and bad, depending on who you ask. And it's like, oh, this introduces too much randomness into Netrunner. This is just a weird thing, and it seems to me like it hasn't really had the impact that a lot of players thought that it would. Caprice in particular, some other cards that are, you know, the bidding mechanic, and it's like, well, Netrunner is just a dice game now, just roll it up. So what would you say to address any of those concerns about the Psy game in particular?
Well, the original Netrunner was a dice game in that it had effects that you randomly roll the dice, and so you're just like, roll it off, whoa, my ice is strength 5, and things of that sort. Obviously, that is something that a lot of players don't necessarily like. It's kind of like the double random. I'm already drawing cards randomly from my deck. Why am I also randomly rolling the die? Like, it's just a lot of variance in the game. So you can have dice games and people like it, and you can have card games and people like it, but you start putting them together and people don't like it anymore. I think that's a fair criticism of, you know, a game like that. So we definitely didn't want to obviously include those sort of effects. And also in the original game, in addition to the dice, you also had a trace mechanic that worked in a blind bid fashion. And that was the main inspiration for the Psy, to bring back some sort of blind bid mechanic to the game without actually bankrupting players by spending all of their credits, which is why it's capped at 0, 1, or 2, and it kind of has a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors feel to it. And so that was kind of where the Psy game came from, and then it made sense to put it into GenCon, since GenCon is not a trace faction. They don't really trace, they have psychic clones, they're doing all this experimentation, so it made sense that they're the ones who are trying to outguess and predict what their opponent is going to do. And so we gave that to GenCon as a replacement for trace. They do have one trace card, which can be pretty nasty in Shinobi, but it's still a little bit undercosted for a trace, not only because it can flatline the runner, but also because it is GenCon, and they primarily are focused on Psy and not trace. And so that was kind of where that came from. And people will argue like, oh, should it just be, you know, random? I randomly choose, and I think that's one way you can approach it, but I think it's not the best way to approach it because there's an economic component with each bid. And as the runner, I don't want to randomly end up bidding 2 like 3 or 4 times in a row. That might lose me the game. So sure, you can do it, but I have a feeling if it came down to it, you might not actually bid 2, 3, or 4 times in a row if it's coming up in your random generator in your head.
Nice. Well, you talked about, so Shinobi is a great example of this. Something I kind of wanted to ask about is this idea of balance, especially between 3 runners and 4 corps, and how you kind of are going about that and thinking about that. Because, you know, in kind of classic game design, you have essentially this, you know, I guess you call it a pie chart, basically. So the 3 runners, and each one is really good at a specific thing, and then there's some crossover. And so it sounds like similar with like what you're talking about with GenCon and Shinobi. It's like, it's not that there's exclusive mechanics to each pie, It's that some things just are more efficient in other factions. Is that the way that you're continuing to approach Netrunner, and kind of how you view it when you start to design new cards?
There are definitely faction strengths and weaknesses, and that's one thing that we added to the game, which I think gives it a lot of longevity compared to the original game. In the original game, you didn't have any factions, and so, you know, it's exciting to a certain extent because you sit across from your opponent, you have no idea what they're playing. Are they playing a tag and bag deck? Or are they just playing like a big ice deck? What are they trying to do? Are they going to fast advance everything? You just don't really know. So you know a little bit more about your opponent when you sit down for a while in the current game, but that also gives you a framework with which to approach the game and kind of set a strategy for how you want to deal with your opponent versus just being completely surprised when it's like, oh wow, you are tagging it, now I'm dead. But I think it's definitely something that we are very careful with. Like, you don't want all the factions to feel like they can do everything, because then you won't actually want to spend your influence on anything. And that's actually a really important part of the surprise of the game, is what you spend your influence on. Like, you can always bring in a couple of tricks from the other factions within limit. And so whenever we're looking at cards, you know, you don't want to be like, oh, well, Genteki, they don't get economy. And, you know, Hospiroid, they don't get card draw. Like, there are certain things that you want everybody to have access to, but they should do it in their own unique way. So what we want is for each faction to feel like they're doing the same sort of things, and then some different things that are specialized things in their own way.
Nice. Let's talk about the current state of things. You got to ask, I mean, so you look at cards that have been fairly ubiquitous throughout the core set and even to this day. And I'm talking about Data Sucker, I'm talking about Desperado. Those kinds of cards that you'll see out of Shaper, you'll see out of Anarch, you'll see out of Criminal, of course. And really popular builds, like Andromeda's been around forever, kind of doing the same sort of thing, now maybe with security testing instead, and a few different variations. Are those kinds of ubiquitous cards, do you think they eventually just work themselves out, or is this something that you're concerned about in any way for the game?
I mean, it is possible that they might work themselves out as a meta develops and as a certain strategy becomes prominent and they're a better counter. Like right now, Andromeda is pretty popular because she's very consistent. However, I think if you're looking at what sort of corp decks are being played with like Replicating Perfection and even NBN, Gabe is potentially a better choice. Like, he's going to give you the economy that you need to deal with that stuff. And so you kind of have to look at it and be like, sure, Andromeda's consistent, but is she the best choice? Wizard can also be really strong if you're running into a lot of assets right now. And so there's always going to be somewhat of a meta choice based on what you think is going to be played. However, whenever you do have a really consistent deck, people are not really going to want to change if it's winning. And if it's winning for you, why change? Like, it's fun to win, and you want to win. That's kind of the point of the game. And so that's something that we definitely try to break up with new cards and new strategies, is what is kind of dominant right now. We probably don't want it to be dominant forever, because then it becomes a bit of a stale environment, and so we will kind of create cards to specifically counter certain card choices or certain deck strategies. And I think you're seeing a little bit of that in the Lunar Cycle with the Corp cards, and you're going to see that kind of more with Runner cards in the next cycle after that.
Well, there's something I've always wondered in regards to Andromeda, is whether or not Sweeps Week was printed to essentially, in a hilarious way, say, Andromeda, get off the stage. You know, like, you're cut, it's over. Right. And whether or not that was kind of intended to work like that.
It was definitely an interaction that we found to be pretty effective against her, and we like that aspect of the card. It would have been printed with or without probably Andromeda in the environment, but it made a lot of sense to do it then. You know, kind of shortly thereafter, because Perfect. It is a cool counter to an identity that is pretty strong.
Yeah, nice. Do you think that any game? So we've seen now Thrones, obviously, I won't say massive, but comparatively, the restricted list, like that kind of balancing mechanism, is like a necessary component of the Game of Thrones card game right now. Without that list, the game just kind of goes wildcats. It goes everywhere. And then we saw kind of a drop-in for Star Wars, kind of mid-regional season, interactions that just were too strong, that weren't caught. Do you accept that some kind of thing, like a restricted list or a band or anything like that, is kind of a foregone conclusion, and it's only a matter of time before a game can print cards without an interaction becoming broken that just wasn't seen? Or is it possible in your head to keep a game so consistently balanced that that kind of mechanism isn't even needed?
I think it's definitely possible to keep a game consistently balanced. To do that, you definitely have to play it a little conservatively, and that's kind of what we've done with Netrunner. Like, I didn't want to have any sort of crazy competitive lists and, you know, restricted list, ban list, whatever, early in a game's life. Like, that's just really not very positive when people are like, oh, I have this card and they're a new player, and then they bring it to a tournament or show up to a meeting and people are like, no, you can't use it that way. Like, that's a bit deflating because you put the card in your deck and you want to use it and it seems like a good card. And so early on, we've definitely played it pretty conservatively with the power level of cards. Like, the best cards are, for the most part, in the core set. You look at those Desperados and Data Suckers and Astro Scripts and things like that, and those are a lot of the cards that are still defining the environment today. And so since then, we've been pretty careful not to create anything that we feel could just create this like competitive monster that forces us to have to make changes to the tournament rules, because that's something you really don't want to have to do. Like, it's a failure of development in a way when that happens. Now, Game of Thrones is a little bit different because now that it's on and people accept it, like they actually kind of are okay with creating some of those powerful cards, and allows you to open up design because you know that you have it there, and sometimes you can even plan on using it. Like, well, this will probably be a restricted card, but it does a lot of good things for the game. And so you can turn that into a positive, but you know, early on in a game's life, I think having to do a restricted list or a banned list is not necessarily going to be great for the long-term future of the game, and we definitely want to try to avoid it in Netrunner. And so I feel confident over the long haul that we can balance it in the card pool, and the card pool can adjust pretty much anything. In the short term, you never know. Like, for example, so far, NBN Near Earth Hub is, you know, everybody's like, is this too strong? Is it going to win everything? It remains to be seen kind of how the top 64 plays out. It seems to be very competitive, but Corp as a whole is very competitive, and also Kentucky and Aspire are doing well. So I don't see it as a crazy outlier with regards to the card pool. Also, it's not the identity that's actually making that deck strong. It's cards like AstroScript Pilot Program, which have been good for a long time, just haven't quite had the support it needed to shine until recently. And so if we were to do anything, it would probably be a response to a tournament like this, where it's just not fun for what players are experiencing if you go up against the same thing over and over and over again and you can't beat it. But if there are counters to a strategy, if you can play around different deck types, then I think that's fine and enough. But, you know, if things continue to develop in a way that we don't like we could easily pull in some sort of list, restricted list, banned list. Probably not a banned list. I don't think anything is close to being banned. Yeah. Maybe a limited list in some fashion. And I think it could be a temporary measure if we did. But right now, I don't think it's necessary. But we'll see how this weekend develops. This is really good information, just seeing what people are playing.
Yeah. If I were to ask you, or if I were to tell you that whenever the core set was printed, that so many of those cards would be relevant years later, is that something that you would say, yes, I intended that to happen? Or was it just that we were playing conservative with the data packs, and so the core set kind of was the baseline power level that we didn't want to go too far over or under?
I would be very happy to hear like the core set is still competitive kind of years later, because I think that's one thing that can also be dangerous is when you outgrow your core set, and that's still the entry point for a player. And so a player buys a core set and it's like, oh, look at these cards I can build, and everybody's like, you don't want to play those cards. Like, that's a terrible card. Why would you play that card? Get this card or that card. So we definitely don't really want to introduce power creep and to replace cards that are in the core set. I want each card to kind of carve out its own niche and to have a place in different decks. And so I think it's a good thing if, you know, the core set remains relevant. Now that said, you don't want it to remain too relevant, because that means the game isn't actually growing, at least horizontally, and opening up new strategies. So hopefully those cards are valid choices, but they aren't the only choices in the game, and there are other choices alongside of them.
So we've talked to you a few times over the years, and always feel really, really solid about your ideas of design and how you're handling Netrunner especially. And I think that shows in the way that it's taken off and the way that the players are generally extremely satisfied with the design of this game. Which makes me wonder, you as Lukas Litzsinger, if I were to ask you, what does a perfect game look like to you? What are the concepts, if you have any, that you would bring up there as far as like things that when you think of this is the game, the perfect game, it doesn't even have to be Netrunner. Maybe Netrunner doesn't have to go the direction, but the game that you would want to play more than anything else, what does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if there's a perfect game. Obviously, that is incredibly subjective, but from my perspective, in a way, Netrunner was the perfect card game to a certain extent, just because when I was developing it, I just kind of made the game that I wanted it to be and played it with people and enjoyed it, and I didn't really have any target audience in mind. I wanted to be faithful to the original game, and it was a fantastic design, so it's there's a couple of areas I feel like we can update and kind of add to the game, get some extra value out of it, but the mechanics were so solid, it's just we don't want to screw it up, and let's just fix some things here and there. I love to tinker with games. Anytime I play a game, by the end of it, I'm already suggesting house rules, and some people are really no, you have to play it as written, and it's this improves the game. And so it was pretty easy to just kind of think of when designing Netrunner as a game that I wanted to play, and I just kind of made the game I wanted to play. And so it's a fantastic card game that rewards skill. There's a lot of choices. The click economy is unparalleled. You have resources that last from one round to another, which is awesome. But I think elements of a perfect game are definitely going to be replayability. It can be fun to play a game once, but it's a true test of a game when you want to play it again and again and again. A story you kind of read once and you can read it again and hopefully it'll be more exciting, but games you almost want to experience multiple times, which is why something that works in a movie or a book that is narrative heavy is going to have a certain shelf life where you're really excited about it. But a game where you can, especially a card game where you can put all of these different elements together, can kind of lead to emergent gameplay where players create their own stories and create their own interactions, and that can be very compelling. And so just having that sort of environment for self-expression, which customizable games give you, and the deck building aspects of Netrunner, Game of Thrones, even Magic, any card game is really unparalleled. It's a specific experience that you can get in a card game that you can't get elsewhere. And so I really like that aspect of it. Also, Netrunner kind of opened my eyes to the power of asymmetry in games. Before, you kind of think especially Euro games, you want everybody to start on equal footing and everybody to have the same chance of winning. And you definitely want it to be balanced, but I think in a way, asymmetrical games create a story within the game even when there aren't heavily infused narrative elements in it. It's somebody's already a little bit on edge. Maybe they see themselves as the underdog. And so there's this built-in struggle to an asymmetrical game that I think kind of reflects reality, because not everybody is starting with the same stuff. We don't all have 2 wood and 2 stone and 2 brick to start with. It's some people have more than others, and so it kind of reflects what we see around us when it's you have stuff, I have stuff. Our goals might be incredibly different. We're not all trying to score victory points or do the same thing, and those games are fun. But I think asymmetrical games can really just push the envelope of how you look at a game and how you relate it to actually life itself.
I love that you said self-expression. That is just a fantastic concept for games that I wouldn't have thought of, but when you said that, it was that's probably the number one for me whenever I'm thinking about it, and so that's really cool to hear. That's a nice touch. As far as anything over this past cycle that was maybe a design challenge, I was kind of thinking in my head about what we could talk to you about and what would be interesting. And the first thing that comes to mind is Nasir, right? This new Shaper runner that, and I said this, I don't know in what form I said it, I don't know if it was a blog or whatever, but that if I was designing Netrunner, heaven forbid, my identities would be like small like movements, right? It's like, well, we'll give you +1 MU and maybe take some influence, and then maybe we'll give you like a special cool little ability, but just something small. And then you drop Nasir, which is just like, here's a brand new way to even think about playing Netrunner, to think about how to build a deck and what's good and how to value cards. So how is that stressful? Like, to just drop something that is so different from the norm and try to design that and balance that within cards that used to be maybe bad and that now become amazing with Nasir out?
I mean, Nasir I actually think was pretty easy to a certain extent. Like, we went through a lot of different ideas of brainstorms, like he's the cyber explorer, what does that mean? But once we got to his current ability, like, it really didn't change. It just kind of worked and functioned and created an interesting play pattern, especially with some of the stealth stuff that's going to continue to come out in this cycle that just the game didn't really have. So it was a different way to play Shaper that, you know, Cade or Chaos Theory didn't really use. And so that was an easy, like, wow, this ability is great, we're going to keep it and put it in the game. It's different. I think actually designing the abilities and on identities that are just those small like power tweaks, like, that's all about efficiency, and so like tournament players are really going to try to get the most out of those. Those are harder to design than something completely out of left field, because it already has potentially built-in support and a lot of comparisons to other cards.
I see, yeah.
And you want it to kind of carve out its own place in the game, and that can be difficult to do when you can just compare kind of like economy with another card.
Yeah.
So like, we won't probably want to do another Shaper that gives a discount on anything or gives a recurring credit anytime soon, because you're just going to compare it to Cade and you're going to figure out which one's better for the number of cards in your deck, and then you just play it. Like, yeah, that's not the most exciting. So we really want identities to push kind of deck archetypes going forward and to open up new design space. So I think Ian Sterling is a good example of that for Criminal. Like, it is an economy ability, but it's an economy ability that plays with the tempo that it runs counter to what Criminal wants to do, which is run early, run often, and score.
Yeah.
So you can still do that with him, but you got to include cards like Data Dealer, Frame Job, if you want to keep your economic engine running at the same time. And then you have to think, well, if I'm giving away points, what is my victory condition? So it looks like an economic ability, but it was actually made to try to break up the Criminal play pattern that was dominant at the time.
Nice. Well, Lucas, I know you got plenty to do today. There's, 128 more Netrunner players coming through here. So. And then tomorrow is a 64-person Swiss, and then a top 16 double elimination.
Top 8 double elimination.
Top 8 double elimination.
It's going to be cutthroat.
Is anyone at the end of this tournament, at the end of Saturday, is anybody going to be alive who has played all of that Netrunner? And is that a concern of yours?
I hope they are. I won't say it's too concerning yet, but we still got 2 more days to go. So I'm feeling recharged after getting a little bit of sleep, and I hope all of the players are as well. They didn't stay out till 2 or 3 a.m. You got to prepare for these sort of things.
That's right.
We'll see what happens. It's gonna be an epic marathon of Netrunner.
Well, so all that to say, I'm going to let you get back to that, of course. The last thing, just kind of as far as picture the game like 2 years from now, right? The game of Netrunner. And there's something that's been on my mind, which is, 2 years from now, I could be running on a server with some face down ice and literally just have so many options for what that ice could be that you just have to know. Like, you just have to guess or just hope that it's not too bad. And how envisioning all of those ice choices in the future affects the way that you might design an icebreaker, right? So we've seen baselines for like Corroder and Gordian Blade to an extent, and even whether you call it Mimic or Ninja, the sentries are a little bit off. I don't feel like they have a definite, like, you must include this sentry breaker. Whereas Corroder is probably the best example of, like, how do you design a barrier breaker that does something different or better than Corroder at breaking barriers. But we've seen things like Overmind. We're seeing like the dogs come out, the Cerebus and that kind of stuff, where you're kind of breaking in different ways. You're removing tokens. There's temporary icebreakers going on. So given that there is going to be, at a point in the game, that moment where you just can't predict the ice anymore, does that affect the way that you think about icebreakers and hope that people start to play different types and styles of icebreakers as the game moves forward?
I don't think that you can say people can't predict the ice. I mean, individually, you are correct. You cannot predict the exact ice that they're going to res. However, with the different subtypes of ice in the game, you still know that you're going to run into barriers and code gates and sentries and maybe some trap ice. And so your icebreaker suite can still reflect that, and actually, hopefully, if you're running, if we do our job correctly, you won't run into this barrier that does like 5 net damage, and you're like, well, I should have had my barrier and my sentry breaker on the table to protect me against damage. So ice falls into specific sort of types, and if you want to run safe, you probably want your sentry breaker on the table. If you want to break in the runs, you probably want a barrier breaker on the table. And so hopefully in 2 years that still holds true, and you can still get a kind of a sense of what you're capable of doing and risking when you have 1 or 2 breaker types on the table. Now, over time, obviously the corp gets more options, and so it's going to be harder for the runner to predict the individual type of ice, and that can be dangerous if, depending on the situation in the game, whether or not you're trying to look for an opening or you don't want to lose your money or keep cards in hand. And so that definitely will be a choice, and I think it kind of is going to lend itself to hopefully opening up ice diversity. Like, as more ice comes out, I actually hope corps put like 1 or 2 copies of every piece instead of like 2 or 3 into their deck, because that makes it a more exciting game. You give up some consistency, but you gain a lot of advantage and surprise. And so as far as icebreakers are concerned, we've definitely been experimenting more with like alternate break costs and alternate ways to kind of use icebreakers rather than just credits. Because if you're just using credits, certain breakers are just going to be better against other breakers. Obviously, ice can change that, but only to a certain extent. Like, factions still have weaknesses, and we don't want to give, for example, shapers like a really awesome sentry breaker that uses credits, because then you would never spend influence splashing anything else and shoring up a weakness in a faction, and that means that now the factions are all the same. And so I think we tried to do some alternate credit costs, being very conservative to not kind of overwhelm any faction with good breakers. But in the end, like, there's only so much design space if you use credits, and I think we want to explore other means of breaking ice with icebreakers, because that's ultimately going to lead to more variety. And you really do want some icebreaker variety in the game, just like you want ice variety in the game. And that's one area I think that we can improve on, and we're shooting to improve on in the future.
All right, Lukas, thank you so much, man. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work, and good luck in the tournament hall today. It's going to be a long day for you.
It will be.
All right.
See what I can do.
All right, cheers.